The silence in exam room 3 wasn't empty. It was heavy, pressed tight against the beige walls like a held breath. I sat on the edge of the table, the paper gown shifting with a dry, crinkling sound that seemed deafening in the quiet. The sharp smell of antiseptic usually overpowered everything here, but today, underneath it, I caught a warmer, grounding scent of cedar and vanilla. Dr. Josie Shenton moved through the routine check, professional and precise, until her hand lingered on my bare shoulder. She leaned in, voice low, and whispered, "I've waited years to see you like this." My heart rate monitor, which had been offering a steady, rhythmic beep, suddenly spiked, the tempo accelerating into a frantic staccato that filled the room. It was a betrayal of my own biology, broadcasting the shock that hit my system like a shot of adrenaline. The air in the room, usually kept at a sterile, preservation-grade chill, suddenly felt stiflingly hot. I looked up, expecting to see her retreating, expecting an apology for a slip of the tongue. But Josie didn't pull back. She stood there, her hand slowly retracting from my shoulder, but her gaze holding mine, absolutely unflinching. Her expression wasn't predatory. It was terrifyingly calm, the look of someone who had finally decided to stop lying. For 5 years, this room had been a sanctuary of neutrality. 5 years of annual checkups where we discussed iron levels, stress management, and the occasional flu shot. I had constructed a version of myself for these appointments. The compliant patient, the professional woman who had her life together. And I had constructed a version of her, too. Dr. Shenton, the brilliant, somewhat distant clinician who treated my body as a complex machine to be maintained. But that whisper shattered the glass wall between us. It wasn't just the words. It was the weight behind them. She hadn't said she wanted to see me like this. She said she had waited. That implied a duration, a history of observation that I had been completely blind to. Or maybe I hadn't been blind. Maybe I had just been pretending not to see the way her eyes sometimes darkened when she walked into the room, or the way she remembered details about my life that weren't in my chart. The sound of latex snapping broke the trance. Josie peeled off her gloves with a sharp, decisive crack that echoed off the linoleum. She turned away then, walking to the counter to make notes in my file, her back rigid. The tension in her shoulders was visible even through the stiff fabric of her white coat. It was a mercy, her turning away. It gave me the permission to breathe, to try and recalibrate a reality that had just tilted on its axis. "I'll give you a moment to dress," she said, her voice returning to its usual professional cadence, though it sounded tighter, strained around the edges. I slid off the table, my legs feeling unsteady, like I'd just stepped off a boat onto dry land. I retreated behind the privacy curtain, a flimsy barrier that suddenly felt like the most important wall in the world. My hands were shaking as I reached for my clothes. The buttons of my shirt, usually so easy to navigate, felt like complex puzzles. I fumbled with the fabric, the rough cotton feeling abrasive against skin that still tingled from the ghost of her touch. Every sound I made, the rustle of denim, the click of a bra clasp, seemed amplified, broadcasting my state of disarray to the woman standing just a few feet away. I tried to rationalize it as I dressed. Maybe I had misheard. Maybe she was talking about a medical baseline. But the lie wouldn't stick. The tone had been too intimate, the proximity too close. This was a breach of every ethical code in the book, a violation of the doctor-patient contract. And yet, the primary emotion flooding my system wasn't outrage. It was a heavy, molten heat that pooled low in my stomach. I realized, with a jolt of panic, that I wasn't angry she had crossed the line. I was terrified, because I wanted her to cross it again. I tucked my shirt in, smoothing the fabric with trembling palms, trying to compose a face that wouldn't give everything away. I took a deep breath, inhaling the lingering scent of sanitized lemon and that underlying note of cedar, and stepped out from behind the curtain. I was fully dressed, buttoned up to the collar, armored in my professional attire. But as I walked back into the main room, I felt more exposed than I ever had when I was wearing that paper gown. The corridor stretching toward the reception desk felt like a gauntlet. Usually, I navigated this path while checking emails, my mind already pivoting back to the demands of my own job. Today, the fluorescent lights hummed with an aggressive frequency that seemed to vibrate against my teeth. Nurses laughed near the way station, phones rang with that incessant office trill, and a printer churned rhythmically in the back office. But it all sounded underwater. My own pulse was the loudest thing in the universe, a thudding drumbeat in my ears that drowned out the mundane reality of the clinic. I focused on my boots hitting the linoleum. Left, right, left, trying to keep my knees from buckling under the weight of what just happened. I felt like an imposter in my own life, walking among people who had no idea that the laws of physics had just suspended in exam room 3. Josie was already there. She must have taken the side door, bypassing the patient hallway to beat me to the front. She stood by the high counter, leaning over a stack of files, talking to the receptionist about insurance codes. Her profile was sharp, composed. The mask was back in place, the steel-reinforced persona of Dr. Shenton, Chief of Internal Medicine. If I hadn't just felt the heat of her breath against my ear, I would have believed nothing had changed. She looked impenetrable. But then she turned as I approached, and for a split second, the facade slipped. Her eyes didn't track my face. They dropped to the hollow of my throat, then snapped back up to meet my gaze. The air thickened, charged with the secret we were now carrying in a room full of strangers. "Your prescription," she said. Her voice was steady, stripped of the huskiness that had been there minutes ago, but the cadence was deliberate. She extended a small slip of paper. I reached for it, intending to take it by the corner, to maintain the safe distance we'd reestablished. But my depth perception was off, or maybe hers was intentional. As I grasped the paper, her fingers brushed against the back of my hand. It wasn't a mistake. It was a firm, deliberate press of warm skin against mine, lasting a heartbeat longer than physics required. A current shot up my arm, grounding and electric all at once. It was a silent confirmation. I said it, and I meant it. "Take care," she added, the words sounding less like a farewell and more like a warning. I mumbled something polite and pushed through the glass doors. The autumn air hit me like a physical slap, cold and biting, a violent contrast to the humidity of the exam room. I got into my car, but I didn't start the engine. I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, staring at the brick facade of the medical center. I replayed the moment on a loop. "I've waited years to see you like this." I dissected the tone, looking for malice, for anything predatory. It wasn't there. It sounded like a confession wrung out of her by exhaustion. It sounded like the pressure of expectations had finally cracked, leaking truth. I thought about the last 5 years. The way she'd lean against the counter during our chats, crossing her ankles, the posture less doctor and more woman at a bar. The way she'd noticed when I cut my hair before anyone else did. The realization washed over me, cold and absolute. I hadn't been imagining the tension. The pull was undeniable, a gravity we had both been orbiting, pretending it was just professional rapport. I had buried my own attraction under layers of protocol, telling myself that my crush on my doctor was a cliché, a safe fantasy that would never breach reality. But she hadn't been safe. She had been waiting. The drive home was a blur of red taillights and wet pavement. When I unlocked my apartment door, the silence that greeted me felt different. Usually, my space was a refuge. Now it felt hollow. I tossed my keys on the table and caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. I looked the same blazer, same hair, but the woman staring back felt like a stranger who had just been handed a dangerous secret. The safety of the last 5 years had evaporated, leaving only the raw, terrifying possibility of what came next. I poured a glass of wine, the dark red liquid swirling against the glass. but I didn't drink it. I just sat on my sofa, the silence of the apartment pressing in, and I started to rewind the tape. Not just today, but the whole archive, 5 years. I needed to understand where the ground had shifted, where I had missed the signs, or where I had chosen to ignore them. I needed to map the history of us before us was even a possibility. I remembered our first meeting clearly. She had just transferred from a prestigious hospital in Chicago, carrying a reputation that seemed too big for our mid-sized city clinic. She walked into the room with a kind of kinetic energy that made the fluorescent lights seem dim by comparison. She was sharper then, maybe a little more guarded, her white coat buttoned all the way up like armor. "I'm Dr. Shenton," she'd said, not offering a hand to shake because she was already pulling on gloves. I remembered feeling intimidated, feeling like a specimen under a microscope. But even then, there was a frequency to her attention that felt different. She didn't just look at the symptoms, she looked at the context. She asked questions that weren't on the intake form, her blue eyes cataloging my answers with an intensity that felt unnerving. Then came the 3rd year. That was the shift, the moment the tectonic plates moved. I had brought a dog-eared copy of a niche essay collection on architectural theory to read in the waiting room. When she walked in, she didn't ask about my blood pressure. She stopped dead in the doorway, staring at the book in my lap. "I didn't think anyone else in this city knew who Lebbeus Woods was," she said, her voice dropping an octave, losing its clinical polish. We spent 10 minutes talking about experimental architecture and the concept of spaces built for crisis, before she even picked up the stethoscope. I remembered the way her laugh sounded that day, surprised, rusty, like she hadn't used it in the office before. She had leaned against the counter, crossing her ankles, the posture less doctor and more woman you meet at a gallery opening. I had walked out of there feeling lighter, feeling like I'd made a friend. But looking back now, through the lens of her whisper, I saw the architecture of something else entirely. It wasn't just friendly banter. It was a survey. She was mapping me, looking for entry points that didn't violate the Hippocratic Oath, but still allowed her inside. The way she remembered that I hated my job in marketing and wanted to pivot to design. The way she'd ask, "How's the portfolio coming along?" with a genuine intensity that went beyond polite small talk. She was checking the structural integrity of my life, waiting for an opening. And I had to be honest with myself. I had been signaling back. I stood up and walked to my bedroom, the wine glass forgotten on the table. I opened my closet and stared at the clothes I wore to those appointments. They were never sweatpants. They were never accidental. I pulled out the emerald silk blouse I'd worn last year. I remembered debating between that and a gray sweater for 20 minutes, checking my reflection from every angle. I had told myself it was about self-respect, about wanting to look professional in front of a peer. But that was a lie. I wanted her to look at me. I wanted the brilliant, untouchable Dr. Shenton to see me as something other than a patient ID number. I had been preening for her, engaging in a silent, sterile courtship under the guise of medical maintenance. The realization made my skin prickle. It was a dangerous game we had been playing, without a rulebook. The power dynamic was massive, a sheer cliff face of ethics and professional boundaries. She held my health in her hands. She knew my biological secrets, my vulnerabilities. That disparity should have been a deterrent. It should have made the idea of her repulsive or predatory, but instead, it acted like an accelerant. The fact that she was forbidden, that she was an authority figure who had broken her own rules for me, made the desire sharp and heavy in my chest. The weight she spoke of wasn't passive. It was an active, disciplined restraint. She had held back a flood for 5 years, and today, the dam had finally cracked. 2 days passed in a haze of distraction. I went to work, I answered emails, but my mind was stuck in exam room 3, replaying the sensation of her breath against my ear. Then, on Wednesday evening, my phone buzzed on the coffee table, a notification from the patient portal. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reached for it, knowing before I even looked that the digital tether had just been pulled taut. The screen of my phone pulsed with a single, sterile notification. New message from patient portal. It was a standard alert, the kind I'd received a dozen times before for benign updates. Negative strep tests, cholesterol numbers, appointment reminders. But tonight, that generic gray banner felt like a live wire sitting on my coffee table. My pulse jumped in my throat, a traitorous echo of the tachycardia I'd experienced in her office 2 days ago. I stared at the device, the glowing light casting long, eerie shadows across the living room, knowing that this wasn't just an automated system update. It was a summons. I opened my laptop, my fingers feeling clumsy and thick as I typed in my password. The portal loaded with agonizing slowness, the spinning wheel a mockingly cheerful blue. When my file finally populated, I scanned the clinical summary first. It was a masterpiece of professional detachment. Patient presents for annual physical, vitals stable, lungs clear. It was precise, clinical, and completely omitted the moment the universe had collapsed in exam room 3. It was a sanitized record of a messy reality. But then I scrolled down to the physician's notes section, usually reserved for generic advice about diet or exercise. There, buried at the bottom, was a single line of text that made the breath catch in my throat. Please call the office to discuss results. Ask for extension 404 directly. Extension 404. That wasn't the reception desk. That wasn't the nurse's station or the appointment line. That was the direct line to her private office, the number usually guarded by a phalanx of administrative assistants. It was a digital key, slipped under the door. I sat there for a long time, the cursor hovering over the number. The fear was a cold knot in my stomach. What if I had misread everything? What if this was the "let's refer you to another physician" talk? What if she was calling to apologize for a momentary lapse in judgment and reestablish the boundaries I was so desperate to cross? But beneath the fear, the hope was a frantic, beating thing. I picked up my phone. I didn't let myself think. I just let the muscle memory of desire take over. I dialed the main number, bypassed the menu, and punched in the extension. It rang once. Twice. Dr. Shenton? Her voice wasn't the polished, projected tone she used in the hallways. It was lower, stripped of the customer service pitch, intimate and immediate. It sounded like she was speaking into the receiver, not at it. "Hi," I said, and I hated how breathless I sounded. I got your message." There was a pause. A beat of silence where I could hear the faint hum of her office ventilation in the background. "I'm glad you called," she said. The relief in her voice was palpable, a soft exhale that traveled down the line and settled in my chest. "I wasn't sure if you would." "You said to discuss results," I said, clinging to the professional pretext like a lifeline. "Is something wrong?" "Medically? No," she said, and I could hear the rustle of paper like she was holding my file. "Your blood work is perfect. Iron is up, vitamin D is solid." She paused again, and the air on the line grew heavy. "But reviewing your chart, I was looking at the vitals from the exam." "The heart rate," I whispered. 120 beats per minute, she recited, the clinical data serving as a shield for what she was really saying. "Spiking at 10:14 a.m., precisely when She trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished, but we both knew how it ended. "Precisely when I touched you." "I've always had white coat hypertension," I lied, though it was a weak defense and we both knew it. "For 5 years, your resting heart rate in my office has never exceeded 72, she countered, her voice soft, unyielding. She wasn't letting me hide. She was stripping away the excuses, one by one. That wasn't hypertension. That was a response. I gripped the phone tighter. Josie. It was the first time I'd said her name without the title. It felt illicit, a verbal trespass. "Tell me," she said, and the command was wrapped in velvet. It wasn't just the exam. was it? The question hung there, suspended in the digital space between us. It was a direct challenge. She was asking me to meet her out on the ledge she had stepped onto 2 days ago. I could deny it. I could say I was just nervous, hang up and find a new doctor. Or I could tell the truth. No, I said, my voice barely audible in the quiet apartment. It wasn't the exam. I heard her let out a breath, a sound that was less professional composure and more raw human relief. Okay, she said. Okay. That changes the protocol. Does it? I can't leave it like this, she said, her tone shifting, becoming decisive. I need to see you. Not for a checkup. I need to clarify the treatment plan. When? Tuesday, she said immediately. 5:30. Everyone else will be gone by then. I'll handle the booking. Just come to the waiting room. I'll be there, I promised. Good, she said. And then, softer. Good night. The line clicked dead. I lowered the phone, staring at the black screen. The digital tether had pulled me in. I wasn't just a patient anymore. I was a co-conspirator. Returning to the clinic on Tuesday evening felt less like a medical appointment and more like walking into a high-stakes negotiation where I didn't know the currency. The waiting room at 5:25 p.m. was a different ecosystem than the chaotic morning rush. The frantic energy of 8 a.m. had dissolved, replaced by a heavy, drowsy stillness. The receptionists were already shutting down their computers, their voices low as they discussed dinner plans and traffic, completely unaware that I was sitting 10 feet away, vibrating with enough nervous energy to power the building. I took a seat in the far corner, away from the few remaining patients, a man coughing into a handkerchief and a woman scrolling listlessly on her phone. I felt like an imposter. They were here for sinus infections and prescription refills. I was here because my doctor had whispered a confession that had rewired my entire nervous system. I picked up a magazine, an outdated issue of Architectural Digest, but the glossy photos of cantilevered living rooms blurred into meaningless shapes. I couldn't focus. My senses were dialed up to an uncomfortable frequency, picking up every detail of the environment I usually ignored. The HVAC system hummed with a low, persistent drone that seemed to synchronize with the rushing blood in my ears. The fabric of the waiting room chair, a rough, industrial tweed, scratched against the back of my hand as I gripped the armrest. The air smelled of sanitized lemon floor cleaner, but underneath it, the stale, recycled oxygen of a building that had been sealed tight all day. I checked my watch. 5:29. Every second stretched, elastic and thin. I wondered if I should have canceled. I wondered if I was misinterpreting the entire situation, if clarify the treatment plan was actually just code for a referral to a psychiatrist. The fear of being wrong, of having projected my own desires onto a professional interaction, clawed at my throat. But then I remembered the phone call, the drop in her voice, the specific, undeniable acknowledgement of my heart rate. That wasn't protocol. That was personal. At 5:31, the heavy oak door leading to the clinical wing opened. I expected a nurse in blue scrubs, holding a clipboard and calling my last name with bored efficiency. Instead, it was Josie. She stood in the doorway, and the air in the room seemed to shift, gravitating toward her. She wasn't wearing the white coat. It was draped over her arm, a shed skin. Without the clinical armor, she looked smaller, but infinitely more dangerous. She was wearing a blouse I'd never seen before, a deep charcoal silk that caught the overhead light in soft, fluid ripples. It was professional, technically, but the fabric was softer, the cut slightly more relaxed than her usual starch-stiff button-downs. It was a choice. A signal. She didn't call my name. She didn't look at the clipboard. She just scanned the room, her gaze sweeping past the coughing man and the scrolling woman until it locked onto me. Her expression was unreadable to anyone else, but to me, it was a shout. There was no professional smile, no customer service brightness, just a direct, unwavering acknowledgement. She tilted her head slightly toward the hallway, a silent invitation that felt more intimate than if she had shouted my name. I stood up, my legs feeling strangely disconnected from my body, and walked toward her. The other patients didn't look up. They didn't know that the woman standing in the doorway wasn't Dr. Shenton, chief of internal medicine, but Josie, the woman who had waited years. I followed her down the hallway. Usually, we would turn left toward the exam rooms, toward the paper gowns and the scales. Today, we walked past them. The clinic was eerily quiet, the lights dimmed in the unused corridors. The only sound was the click of her heels and the softer thud of my boots. We were moving backstage, past the sterile facade, into the machinery of her life. She stopped at the end of the hall, at a heavy wooden door with a frosted glass pane. Dr. J. Shenton, private. She unlocked it and held it open for me. I stepped inside, and the smell hit me instantly. Not antiseptic, not latex, but old paper, rich coffee, and that same warm cedar scent I'd caught during the exam. This wasn't a medical space. It was a sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined one wall, crammed with medical texts and thick hardcovers on history and art. A mahogany desk dominated the center, cluttered with files and a half-drunk cup of tea. Behind it, a large window offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, the buildings beginning to twinkle as the twilight deepened into night. Josie stepped in behind me. The door clicked shut, the latch engaging with a definitive metallic snap that sealed us in. The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. The hum of the clinic, the traffic outside, the doubts in my head, everything was cut off. It was just the two of us in a room that felt too small and too large all at once. The air thickened, charged with the static of unsaid things. She didn't move behind the desk. She didn't retreat to the safety of her high-backed leather chair, the throne of her authority. Instead, she walked past me, tossing her white coat onto a hook, and leaned back against the edge of the heavy mahogany desk. She crossed her ankles, her hands gripping the edge of the wood on either side of her hips. It was a casual posture, vulnerable and open. She was dismantling the hierarchy physically, lowering herself to my eye level, removing the barrier of the desk between us. She looked at me, the silk of her blouse rising and falling with a breath she was clearly trying to steady. We were off the map now. The chart was closed. The protocol was gone. "I shouldn't have done that," Josie said finally. Her voice was low, devoid of the crisp, authoritative projection she used in the exam room. It was softer, rougher around the edges, like she was testing the acoustics of this new shared space. She looked down at her hands, which were gripping the edge of the mahogany desk, her knuckles pale against the dark wood. "Not in that room. Not while you were wearing a paper gown and I was wearing the coat. It was a lapse." "I didn't mind," I said, the truth tumbling out before I could filter it through a layer of politeness. I was standing in the middle of the Persian rug, feeling untethered, my hands hanging uselessly by my sides. "I know," she said, looking up. Her gaze was direct, piercing through the twilight gloom of the office. "That's the problem. If you had minded, if you had been repulsed, I could have filed it away as a mistake and moved on. But I felt your pulse spike. I felt the way you leaned into it." She took a breath, a deep, steadying inhale that seemed to rattle in her chest. "I've spent 5 years perfecting the cadence of those exams. I have a script. I check the lymph nodes, I listen to the heart, I ask about the stress at your job. It's a rhythm designed to keep me detached, to keep me objective." She pushed off the desk and took a step toward the window, her silhouette framed against the city lights. But the script stopped working about 3 years ago. I'd walk into that room and I wouldn't be thinking about your iron levels. I'd be wondering if you were still reading that book on brutalist architecture. I'd be wondering if you were happy. And then I'd have to force myself back into the role of the clinician, reciting the protocol while my mind was somewhere else entirely. Hearing her admit it, voicing the very tension I had spent years analyzing in secret, felt like a physical release. The knot of anxiety that had lived in my chest since Friday began to unravel. I hadn't been crazy. I hadn't been projecting a fantasy onto a professional relationship. The validation washed over me, warm and absolute. The fear that I was an intruder in her life dissolved, replaced by a raw, immediate need to bridge the remaining distance between us. "I thought I was imagining it," I said, moving a step closer to the desk. "I told myself you were just attentive, that you were just a good doctor." Josie turned back to face me, a wry smile touching the corner of her mouth. "I am a good doctor," she said. "That's why I know I can't be yours anymore." The statement hung in the air, heavy and final. "I didn't want you to stop being my doctor because I needed to see you," she continued, her voice gaining strength, stripping away the hesitation. "But I can't be your doctor if I want to see you. The two realities are incompatible. It's a conflict of interest so deep it would bury us both." She gestured to the room, to the degrees on the wall, the medical texts, the trappings of her career. This is a precise world. It relies on boundaries. What I feel for you, it ignores them." She paused, searching for the language to bridge the gap between her profession and her desire. "Think of it like a complex surgery. We have a connection, this professional tether that's vital but also restrictive. To save the part of this that actually matters, the personal part, we have to sever the professional limb. It's high risk. It requires precision. We have to cut the patient-doctor bond cleanly, without damaging the people underneath. If we leave any jagged edges, if we try to be both, we'll fail." Her metaphor was clinical, grounded in her world, but the intent was deeply intimate. She was proposing a controlled demolition of the only relationship we had ever known, all for the hope of building something new in the wreckage. "I don't want jagged edges," I said, my voice steady now. "I want the clean cut." I looked at her. Really looked at her. Seeing the woman who had been hiding in plain sight for half a decade. "You weren't the only one with a script, Josie. I used to check the mirror in the lobby 3 times before I came up. I wore that emerald blouse last year because I knew it was your favorite color. You mentioned it once in passing about a painting in the hallway." Her eyes widened slightly, a flash of surprise and pleasure. "I felt the coil of tension every time you touched me," I admitted. "I stopped breathing when you listened to my heart, terrified you'd hear how fast it was beating, not because of anxiety, but because of you." "I heard it," she whispered. "I always heard it." "Ideally, the cut is precise," Josie murmured, the medical metaphor still lingering in the quiet room like smoke. She moved behind the desk, not to sit in the high-backed leather chair that signaled her authority, but to access the top drawer. The sound of the heavy wood sliding on its tracks was the only noise in the office, a friction that grated against the silence. She pulled out a single, thin manila folder. She didn't need to search for it. She had prepared it. It had been waiting there, a silent contingency plan, perhaps since the moment she decided to whisper to me in the exam room. Or maybe even before that. Maybe she had printed these papers the day she realized she remembered the name of my favorite architect, but forgot to check my blood pressure until the very end of the appointment. She placed the folder on the desk and opened it. The document inside was standard, the kind of bureaucratic form I'd filled out a dozen times for insurance claims or address changes. Authorization for release of medical information, transfer of care. The font was boring, the layout sterile. But looking at it lying there on the dark mahogany, it felt like the most significant document I've filled out the provider details, Josie said, her voice steady but low. "I'm referring you to Dr. Evans at the practice across town. She's excellent, she's thorough, and more importantly, she isn't in love with you." The words hung there, suspended in the amber light of the desk lamp. She hadn't looked up when she said it. She was focused intensely on the paper, using a heavy black fountain pen to check a box near the bottom. The admission was casual, almost thrown away, but it landed in the center of my chest with the weight of a stone. She wasn't in love with me. She isn't in love with you. The implication was clear. "Sign here," she said, turning the document toward me, "and initial the bottom clause." I stepped up to the desk. The physical barrier of the furniture was still there, but she leaned over it, pointing the tip of the pen at the signature line. I leaned in to meet her. Suddenly, the desk didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like a bridge. She was close, dangerously close. I could see the fine grain of her skin, the slight tremor in the hand holding the pen. The scent I had chased in the exam room, that mix of antiseptic and something warmer, was overwhelming here. It was expensive perfume, sandalwood and jasmine, layered over the dark, roasted smell of the coffee sitting cold in her mug. It was the scent of her reality, not her profession. I took the pen from her. Our fingers didn't just brush, they collided. It was a brief, clumsy contact, skin against skin, but the result was kinetic. The electricity wasn't static anymore. It was a current, a live circuit closing between us. My hand shook as I gripped the heavy barrel of the pen. I looked at the line where I was supposed to sign my name. It felt like standing on a precipice. Once I wrote this, the safety net was gone. I would no longer be her patient. I would just be a woman standing in a room with another woman who had risked her entire career for this moment. "Josie," I said, the name feeling heavy on my tongue. "If I sign this, there's no going back. If this doesn't work—" "I know," she interrupted, her eyes finally meeting mine. They were dark, dilated. "I've never done this before. I have never crossed this line. If the board found out I solicited a patient for a personal relationship before the transfer was complete, I could lose my license. I could lose this practice." She looked around the room, at the books, the degrees, the life she had built. Then she looked back at me, and the fear in her eyes was eclipsed by something fierce. "But I'm done pretending. I'm done checking your heart rate and pretending mine isn't matching it beat for beat. Sign the paper." It was a command, but it was also a plea. I lowered the pen. The scratch of the nib against the paper was loud, a definitive, irreversible sound. I signed my name. I dated it. I initialed the clause that said I was leaving her care voluntarily. I capped the pen and set it down. The click was final. Josie reached out and took the paper. She didn't file it. She didn't put it back in the folder. She just set it aside, on a stack of other papers, face down. The act was symbolic. The patient was gone. The file was closed. The protocol had been rewritten, and the ink was already dry. "Done," she exhaled, the tension in her shoulders dropping by an inch. "You're not my patient anymore." "No," I agreed, the word vibrating in the sudden quiet. "I'm not." The paper was gone. The legal tether that defined us as protector and protected, authority and subject, was severed. Now, it was just physics. Josie pushed off the desk, and the movement was entirely different from the efficient clinical pivots I was used to. She didn't walk like a doctor now. She walked like a woman who had just won a very long, very quiet war. She moved into my personal space, collapsing the buffer zone, that professional 3 feet required for objective observation, until it evaporated completely. She stood close enough that I could. She looked at me. For 5 years, her gaze had been a diagnostic tool. She would scan my face for pallor, for pain, for signs of fatigue. She would look at my pupils to check for reaction times, her expression guarded by a wall of medical curiosity. But this was different. This was a hunger. She was looking at me not as a puzzle to be solved or a machine to be tuned, but as a person to be known. Her gaze held mine, unflinching, stripping away the last layers of my own defense. I felt pinned by it, not in a way that made me want to run, but in a way that made me want to stay very, very still and let it happen. "You're shaking," she said softly. It wasn't a clinical observation to be noted in a file. It was a murmur of wonder, a recognition of the effect she had on me. "I'm not cold," I managed to whisper, my voice catching in a throat that suddenly felt too tight. "I know." She raised her hand. I watched it move in slow motion, the world narrowing down to that single gesture. This was the same hand that had held a stethoscope against my chest, the same hand that had palpated my lymph nodes, the same hand that had written the prescriptions that kept me healthy. But as it approached my face, the context shattered. There was no latex barrier. There was no clinical detachment. Her fingers brushed the hair back from my temple, a gesture so tender it felt like a bruise. Then she traced the line of my jaw. It was a callback to the exam room, to that moment her hand had lingered on my shoulder, but the intent had transmuted. That touch had been a question. This was an answer. Her fingertips were warm, rougher than I expected, grounded and real. She traced the bone structure of my face as if she were memorizing it, not for a chart, but for herself. The sensation was overwhelming. My breath hitched, a jagged sound in the quiet office. I leaned into her touch instinctively, my eyes fluttering shut as the darkness behind my eyelids spun. I felt the rough pad of her thumb brush against the corner of my mouth, and every nerve ending in my body lit up like a city grid coming online. "Open your eyes," she whispered. I obeyed. She was close, so close. I could see the flecks of gold in her blue eyes, the slight dilation of her pupils that betrayed her own adrenaline. "Now that I'm not your doctor," she said, her voice dropping to a register that vibrated in my chest, "I can tell you the truth. I didn't just wait to see you. I waited to tell you." "Tell me what?" I asked, the words barely forming. "How beautiful you looked in that light," she said. "In the exam room, when the sun hit your profile, it took every ounce of discipline I had not to drop the chart and do exactly this." She didn't kiss me. The air between our mouths was thick, heavy with the promise of it, but she held back. It was a restraint born of respect, or maybe of savoring the moment. She was letting the tension pull taut, letting the anticipation build until it was a physical ache in the center of my chest. It wasn't about the consummation yet. It was about the permission to touch, the permission to want. She was rewriting the history of every sterile interaction we'd ever had, overlaying it with this new, terrifying intimacy. I reached up, my hand trembling, and gripped her wrist. I didn't push her away. I held her there, anchoring her hand against my face. "I wanted you to," I confessed. "Every time you walked into the room, I wanted you to drop the chart." Josie let out a shaky breath, her forehead resting against mine for a fleeting second. The contact was grounding, solid. "We have to be careful," she murmured, though her hand didn't move. "We have to do this right." "I don't care about right," I said. "I care about this." "I know." She pulled back slightly, just enough to look at me again. "But we're not in the exam room anymore. And we're not in the waiting room. We're here." I looked around. The medical books, the degrees, the skeleton of her career. It suddenly felt too sterile, too watched by the ghosts of patients past. This room was a vessel for her authority, and even though we had severed the tie, the walls still remembered the rules. "Not here," I said, realizing it at the same moment she did. "No," she agreed, her thumb brushing my cheek one last time before she slowly, reluctantly, lowered her hand. "Not here." "We can't stay here," Josie murmured, stepping back. The physical separation felt like a tear in the room's atmosphere, a sudden drop in pressure. "And we certainly can't walk out together. Not tonight. Not yet." She was right, of course. The ink on the transfer paper was barely dry. Technically, legally, we were strangers again. Two civilians in a city of millions. But practically, Walking out of her private office with flushed skin, dilated pupils, and the scent of each other clinging to our clothes would raise questions neither of us wanted to answer. We needed neutral ground. We needed a place where the air didn't smell of antiseptic and old paper, where the ghosts of my medical history weren't watching from the file cabinets. We needed a space where the only thing being examined was the chemistry that had just detonated between us. "The wine bar on 4th, I suggested, my voice steadying, though my pulse was still hammering a frantic rhythm. "The vault. It's dark, the booths are high, and it's nowhere near the medical district. No one from the hospital goes there." "I know it," she said, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across her face. A smile that had nothing to do with bedside manner and everything to do with intent. "Give me 20 minutes to finish closing up. I need to file this." She gestured to the signed paper, the document that had liberated us. "Somewhere very safe. Somewhere permanent." I picked up my bag, the leather strap feeling heavy in my hand. Leaving her felt wrong, a violation of the magnetic pull that had just snapped into place. But the promise of what was coming made the departure bearable. It was an open loop of desire, a tension that would pull taut over the next 20 minutes until it snapped us back together. I walked to the heavy oak door, then turned back for one last look. Josie was leaning against the doorframe of her inner office. The rigid, armored posture of Dr. Shenton, the chief of internal medicine, was gone. Her shoulders were relaxed, her hip cocked to the side, her arms crossed loosely over that charcoal silk blouse. She didn't look like a physician evaluating a case or a mentor guiding a patient. She looked like a woman anticipating a date. She looked like trouble. 20 minutes, she promised, her eyes dark and unflinching. "Don't be late." "I've been waiting 5 years to be early, Josie," I said. The walk to the elevator felt like floating. The corridor that had been a gauntlet of anxiety an hour ago was now just a hallway. The reception desk was empty, the computers dark, the phones silent. I pressed the button, and when the doors slid open, I stepped into the metal box not as a patient with a racing heart, but as a woman with a dangerous secret. The descent to the lobby was a decompression. With every floor that passed, the weight of the last 5 years lifted. The pressure of expectations, of the protocol we had both clung to, cracked and fell away. I walked out through the automatic doors and into the city night. The sensory shift was immediate. The sterile, controlled climate of the clinic was replaced by the chaotic symphony of the street. The air was cold, biting against my heated skin, carrying the scent of rain and exhaust. The glare of streetlights blurred in the damp air, creating a kaleidoscope of neon and shadow that felt cinematic. The noise of traffic, usually an annoyance, sounded like a rhythm, a driving beat pushing me toward 4th Street. I walked to my car, my heels clicking a cadence on the pavement that felt faster, lighter. I sat in the driver's seat and checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. My lipstick was slightly smudged. My eyes were bright, alive in a way they hadn't been in years. The thrill of the forbidden was still there. The knowledge that we were breaking an unspoken social law, but it had transmuted. It wasn't a source of shame anymore. It was fuel. The sultry promise of the evening stretched out before me, a map with no edges. I started the engine. The radio played a low, thumping bass line that matched the anticipation thrumming in my veins. I wasn't driving home to an empty apartment to analyze a whisper. I was driving to a dimly lit bar to meet a woman who had stripped off her white coat to be with me. The wait was over. The night was just beginning. I paused at the entrance, catching my reflection in the darkened glass. No longer a patient, but a woman stepping into a fire she'd helped kindle. If you want to see where this new protocol leads, subscribe and turn on notifications. My phone buzzed in my hand, lighting up the dark street with a single message. I'm already in the back booth, and I'm not wearing the white coat.